They called it Carter Hill, a name that carried weight far beyond its fences, a name spoken with both reverence and unease. In 1847, Georgia was a land bound by heat and habit, and the Carters were its proud custodians of tradition. Generations had tilled that soil, each one convinced that they were maintaining order in a world determined to unravel. Evelyn Carter was the matriarch, a woman whose composure had been mistaken for grace, and whose discipline was often mistaken for piety. She believed herself chosen to uphold a legacy, and she did so with a calm that frightened those who served her more than open cruelty ever could. To her, the plantation was not merely land, it was inheritance, authority, destiny shaped by obedience to a system that promised prosperity to those willing to look away from what it demanded in return. Her eldest son, Samuel, had left Carter Hill years earlier to study in Charleston, sent away to absorb the manners and intellect of distant men who spoke of liberty in lecture halls far removed from its cost. He returned expecting home to feel smaller, tamer, perhaps kinder. But as he stepped across the familiar threshold, he sensed something altered, as if the air itself held memory too heavy to move. Every face he greeted smiled too quickly. Every word of welcome seemed practiced. The plantation appeared orderly, but its rhythm was wrong. Overseers hurried their tasks. Ledgers closed when he entered a room. His mother spoke often of duty, less often of truth. At dinners, she spoke of God, of patience, of the way providence rewarded endurance. But when Samuel looked into her eyes, he saw something restless, a tension hidden beneath serenity. It was the look of someone who feared questions more than judgment. Among the enslaved was Martha, known for her quiet strength and her unshakable memory. She was said to remember every name of those sold, every year a child vanished, every face that left in chains. She carried the plantation's true record not in ink but in story. History, for her, lived in whispers shared at dusk, in songs that carried the weight of things forbidden to speak aloud. Her life moved at the edge of notice, yet everything passed through her sight. One afternoon, Samuel found himself in his father's study, a room sealed since the funeral. Dust had gathered, but the order was untouched, every object precisely where it had been left. On the desk lay a book bound in dark leather, unmarked but familiar. It was a ledger, filled with the language of commerce, numbers, names, and a single word repeated so often it became rhythm, increased. At first he thought it referred to harvest yields, but the columns did not align with any crop he knew. The sums were too exact, the dates too irregular. It was only when he reached the later pages that understanding began to take shape, slow and unbearable. The ledger did not measure land or cotton. It measured lives. The handwriting was his mother's. Her signature was precise, her arithmetic immaculate. There were notes in the margins, references to lineage, inventory, and words that turned blood into arithmetic. The realization came quietly, not as shock but as a spreading cold. The plantation's wealth had not come from endurance or providence. It had come from manipulation so deeply woven into routine that it had become indistinguishable from law. Samuel closed the book but the figures would not leave his mind. That night, he could not sleep. He heard the faint murmur of voices outside, the shuffle of feet on the dirt path that led to the quarters, and he realized how little he had ever listened to those sounds before. Each noise was a story he had ignored. Each silence, a truth buried beneath obedience. The next morning, he confronted his mother. He spoke gently at first, unsure how to shape accusation into language. Evelyn listened without interruption. When he mentioned the ledger, her expression did not change. She told him some records were not meant for his concern. She said certain duties belonged to those strong enough to protect the family's future. Her voice did not tremble, but something behind it did, a shadow of fear that she would not name. She told him the world was not kind to those who questioned its order. Samuel left her room shaken. The conversation had answered nothing. Instead, it deepened the question. He began to look at Carter Hill differently. The land that had once seemed abundant now felt like an enclosure. The people he passed no longer looked at him directly. Their faces held memory of decisions made long before he returned, decisions he could no longer ignore. Martha, too, had noticed the change. She saw Samuel's unease, the way he lingered near the quarters at dusk, the way his eyes followed the horizon as if expecting it to answer him. She did not speak to him, not yet. But she understood that something within the house had shifted. Secrets, once sealed by silence, had begun to breathe. In the weeks that followed, the order of the plantation began to falter in small ways. Workers delayed their tasks. Records went missing. Evelyn dismissed a servant without explanation. Rumors began to spread, quiet, dangerous rumors that the Carter legacy was not as pure as it claimed. And though no one dared speak them aloud, everyone felt their weight. Samuel returned again and again to the ledger, unable to decide whether to destroy it or expose it. The book seemed to pulse with consequence, as though every page waited for a hand brave enough to hold it open to the light. Yet every time he lifted the cover, he heard his mother's voice, calm, composed, unwavering, reminding him that everything had its place, and that those who disrupted order rarely survived its aftermath. Still, the question remained. How much of what his family called inheritance was built on something that could not be forgiven? How long could silence hold back the truth? And though the sun still rose over Carter Hill, and life appeared unchanged, the air itself had begun to carry something new, a presence that moved unseen, shaping every decision, every breath, every glance between mother and son. Something darker was lurking, something far more dangerous to reveal, or so it seemed. Samuel began to notice that his mother no longer looked at him directly. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of ritual rather than truth. Each morning she held court at the breakfast table, speaking of the weather, the neighbors, the state of the harvest. The servants moved in practiced silence, their eyes fixed on the floor, their gestures exact. Yet beneath the rhythm of the house there was an unease, an invisible current that threaded between every room and every glance. Samuel could feel it watching him as he walked the corridors, as if the walls themselves remembered more than they were willing to reveal. He returned again to the study, but the ledger was gone. In its place lay a stack of freshly written papers, sermons copied in his mother's hand, each one circling the same idea, that God had set every creature in its rightful place, and that to question that order was to invite ruin. She had replaced arithmetic with theology. That evening, he confronted her once more. He spoke of conscience, of the value of a human life, of what he had seen beyond the borders of their land. She listened without moving, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain teacup. When he asked her where the ledger had gone, she smiled faintly and told him that certain things were never meant to be preserved, that memory itself could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Then she began to speak of bloodlines, of the sacred duty of preservation, of how every generation must guard what the one before had built. She said it was not cruelty that guided her but necessity, that without discipline the world would collapse into chaos. Her tone was calm, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of someone who had repeated the same justification for too long. Samuel realized then that her faith was not conviction but fear, the fear of losing control, of seeing the structure she worshipped crumble under the weight of its own lies. Outside, life on the plantation continued. The fields shimmered beneath the sun, but the workers moved slower, their songs muted. Martha observed from a distance, her expression unreadable. She had overheard fragments of the conversation through the open window, enough to understand that the family's order was beginning to fracture. That night, as the others gathered after dusk, she began to speak. She told them what she had heard, not as accusation but as remembrance. Each word she spoke was an act of quiet resistance. She recited names that had been erased from records, births that had never been written down, bonds that the family had broken and claimed as divine right. The others listened in silence, the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. They repeated her words softly, ensuring that they would travel beyond the boundaries of Carter Hill, that the truth would not vanish with the ink Evelyn had chosen to destroy. Days passed, and the unease deepened. Samuel sensed eyes following him wherever he went. The overseer watched him with suspicion, his mother avoided speaking of the past altogether. Letters arrived from neighboring estates asking after their business affairs, inquiries that sounded polite but carried undertones of gossip. Samuel realized that rumors had already escaped. The cracks in his mother's composure widened. She began attending church services more frequently, summoning the preacher to her parlor and insisting that prayer would restore harmony. But no prayer could cleanse the unease that had settled over the house. The servants whispered of strange occurrences, doors that opened on their own, candles that flickered without wind, voices carried across the fields at night. Whether these were real or born of fear no one could say, but they all felt the same truth: the plantation was sick, not from decay of soil but from the weight of its own secrets. Martha continued to tell her stories. Each night they grew longer, more detailed. She spoke of generations lost, of promises broken, of love twisted into ownership. For the first time, the enslaved began to remember themselves not as property but as witnesses. Their stories formed a map of the house that Evelyn had built, a map drawn not in lines or ink but in memory and breath. Samuel heard the murmurs from his window. He could not make out the words, but he felt their rhythm, the slow pulse of something ancient reclaiming its voice. One night, he entered the study again and found that the sermons his mother had copied were gone. In their place was the ledger once more, laid open on the desk as if it had returned of its own will. The handwriting was unchanged, but beneath the figures he noticed faint impressions, marks where another hand had once pressed too hard while writing. It struck him that the book itself was a palimpsest, a record layered over countless others. He realized then that no amount of denial could erase what had been done. The truth was not confined to paper, it lived in the land, in the people, in every breath that passed through the halls of Carter Hill. The next morning, his mother addressed the household with uncharacteristic fervor. She spoke of duty and faith, of obedience and order. Her voice rose with a desperation that betrayed her calm exterior. Samuel watched as she clutched her Bible, her hands trembling slightly. Behind her, Martha stood motionless, her expression composed, her gaze unwavering. For the first time, Evelyn faltered beneath the weight of that gaze. It was as if the order she had so carefully constructed could no longer contain the truth pressing against it from all sides. The cracks in the house widened that day, though no walls collapsed, no voices were raised. The real collapse was quieter, internal, a breaking of belief. The system that had sustained them was beginning to unravel not through rebellion or force but through remembrance itself. Samuel knew then that his mother's greatest fear was not exposure to the world outside but acknowledgement within her own walls. The truth was no longer hidden in ledgers or buried in sermons. It was alive, spoken softly in the dark, spreading through memory like a pulse that refused to die. Something darker was lurking, something far more dangerous to reveal, or so it seemed. The summer heat settled over Carter Hill with a heaviness that seemed to still even the birds. Samuel spent his days searching through the corners of the house his mother never entered, driven not by curiosity but by something he could no longer name. In the attic he found a chest wrapped in canvas, its lock rusted, its hinges reluctant. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, the ink browned by time but the words still legible. They were addressed to his grandfather, written by men who spoke of trade, lineage, and the exchange of lives as if discussing the weather. There were receipts for transactions, notes of gratitude for cooperation, careful acknowledgments of favors repaid. And among them, letters written in his mother's hand, younger, sharper, filled with plans and instructions for maintaining what she called continuity. The letters spoke of bloodlines not as heritage but as resource, of children as extensions of property, of human lives measured against balance sheets. It was not love that bound the family together but control, a web woven so tightly that even affection had been transformed into ownership. Samuel read until the words began to blur, until the weight of what he understood pressed against his chest like a physical wound. He confronted his mother again, not with anger but with disbelief. He placed the letters before her and asked if she recognized her own writing. She looked at them for a long moment and said that she did, that every word had been necessary, that the world they lived in demanded choices no one could make without consequence. She spoke of the early years, of how the family had nearly lost everything when the markets collapsed, of how her father had taught her that survival required a hardness of heart. She said she had watched good people destroyed because they tried to be merciful, that she had learned to confuse mercy with weakness. Then her voice softened, and she admitted that she had become what she once swore she would never be. She said there were nights when she heard voices in the halls, that she sometimes saw faces she had ordered forgotten, that she prayed for silence but received only memory in return. She told him the system demanded that someone carry the burden of cruelty so that others could remain clean, and that she had taken that burden willingly because she believed it would protect them. She said she now understood that there was no protection in such a world, only inheritance, each generation condemned to repeat the sins of the one before under new justifications. Samuel listened, feeling the last fragments of the house's illusion crumble. The walls that had once felt solid now seemed hollow, held together by habit and fear. He realized that every kindness he had ever known from his mother had been shaped by the same hand that had written those letters, that even her tenderness was a form of possession. In that moment he understood that there could be no redemption through silence, no reconciliation within the framework that had created the harm. The only way forward was to break the foundation itself, to expose everything, to strip away the names, the lineage, the history that had been built upon cruelty disguised as order. He knew that to do so would destroy the family's legacy, that his mother would see it as betrayal, that the community would turn on him. Yet the weight of what he had read left him no choice. The truth had already taken root inside him, and silence had become another form of complicity. He left her room without another word, carrying the letters as proof of what could no longer be denied. Outside, the sky hung low and colorless, the air thick with the scent of dust and heat. The plantation stretched before him like a monument to a lie, every field a record of labor stolen and lives consumed. He thought of Martha, of the stories she carried, of how memory persisted even when written words were destroyed. He began to see that the true inheritance of Carter Hill was not wealth but guilt, passed from hand to hand under the guise of duty. That night, Samuel sat by the window and read the letters again, each one a confession written in the language of commerce. The repetition of dates and names formed a rhythm, and within that rhythm he heard the echo of something ancient, a cycle that bound oppressor and oppressed alike. He realized that the corruption of the plantation was not a single act of evil but an entire structure built to sustain itself through generations. Every law, every prayer, every tradition served to preserve the illusion of righteousness while feeding on suffering. The realization filled him with both clarity and dread. He understood that to expose it would be to unravel not just his family but the world they inhabited. But he also understood that to preserve it was to continue the curse. As the night deepened, he made his decision. The house around him seemed to listen, the old boards creaking under the weight of unspoken truth. He gathered the letters, bound them together, and hid them beneath his coat. He would take them beyond the borders of Carter Hill, to the towns where paper and ink still held the power to make men listen. He would carry the truth that his mother could not bear to face, even if it meant the end of everything she had built. The choice no longer belonged to her. It belonged to history. Something darker was lurking, something far more dangerous to reveal, or so it seemed. The days grew shorter though the heat did not fade, and the stillness of Carter Hill began to break in ways no one could ignore. The workers whispered in the fields, their words carried low but urgent, their movements slower, deliberate, fretted with purpose. Martha became their center, her voice steady, her resolve quiet but unshakable. She spoke not of vengeance but of freedom, of leaving behind the land that had claimed generations. She told them that silence had kept them bound, that memory now demanded action. They began to meet in the sheds near the edge of the property, under the cover of night, planning routes toward the river and beyond. Each meeting was a risk, but fear had changed its shape, it no longer kept them still, it pushed them forward. Samuel learned of their plans through a child who trusted him enough to speak. At first, he felt only dread, not for his safety but for theirs, knowing the punishment that would come if they were discovered. But then he understood that he was no longer separate from them. His mother's blood had given him privilege, but the truth he carried had stripped him of belonging. The ledger and the letters had made him an outsider in his own home. He sought out Martha in the darkness, and when she saw him, she did not flinch. She looked at him as if she already knew why he had come. He told her of the records, of what his mother had done, of what he had found in the attic. She listened, her expression unreadable, and then she said that knowing was not enough. Knowledge without courage was just another kind of silence. He told her he would help, that he would guide them through the paths his mother's overseers used to avoid patrols, that he would destroy what remained of the records so that their names could never again be used to claim ownership. Martha nodded, but she told him the decision was not his to make. Freedom, she said, was not something given. It was taken. Evelyn sensed the change long before she saw it. Her servants no longer came when she called. The routine of the house fractured, meals uneaten, doors left open, the air thick with absence. She wandered the halls clutching her Bible, reading aloud passages about obedience and destiny, her voice trembling as if each word fought against her. She spoke to her late husband as though he were still seated beside her, asking him whether they had done enough to keep their legacy pure. When no answer came, she began to pray aloud, louder each day, until her prayers became accusations against the God she had once claimed to serve. She said she had been faithful, that she had followed every rule, that her suffering must be a test, that order would return if only she endured. But even as she spoke, she could feel the walls withdrawing from her touch, the very house rejecting her. One evening, Samuel returned from the fields and found her standing in the doorway of the study, staring at the open window where the curtains moved in the night wind. She asked if he still intended to betray her. He said it was not betrayal to seek truth. She told him he would destroy everything his father had built. He answered that what his father had built was already ruin. For the first time, she slapped him. The sound echoed through the empty house like a final judgment. She turned away and said nothing more. That night, the plan was set in motion. The enslaved gathered at the edge of the fields, carrying what little they owned, cloth bundles, water, tools. Samuel joined them without hesitation. He had burned the letters earlier that evening, their ashes scattered into the air that hung heavy with the scent of coming rain. Martha led the group, her steps measured, her eyes fixed ahead. They moved toward the stables first, cutting the horses loose, letting them run wild into the darkness. The overseer's house stood empty, the men had fled, sensing the storm they could not control. Inside the main house, Evelyn lit candles in every room, as if to summon light strong enough to erase the encroaching dark. She walked from chamber to chamber, whispering the names of her ancestors, demanding they return to guide her. But no guidance came. Only the sound of fire cracking in the distance as torches met dry wood. The first flames took hold at the far end of the cotton house, orange against the black sky. Then the barn ignited, sparks flying upward like a release of years of silence. Samuel watched from the field, his face lit by the glow. He saw the house that had defined him begin to change shape, its proud outline swallowed by light. Evelyn stood at her window, eyes fixed on the flames, her mind unable to separate destruction from deliverance. She believed for a moment that this was the purification she had prayed for, that the fire would cleanse the land and restore her order. But as the smoke thickened, she understood the truth, that it was not purification but erasure, that everything she had protected was finally being consumed by what it had denied. She sank to her knees, clutching the Bible to her chest, whispering verses she no longer believed. Martha and the others reached the road leading into the woods. The fire behind them painted the sky in red, and though they did not speak, they all understood that they were walking away not only from a place but from a history. Samuel followed behind, uncertain whether he belonged with them or anywhere at all. When he looked back, he saw his mother's house collapsing inward, timbers falling, light swallowing shadow until nothing remained but embers and the faint outline of chimneys against the horizon. He felt no triumph, only a strange calm. The fire was both ending and beginning, judgment and release. By dawn, Carter Hill was nothing but smoke. The fields smoldered, the air thick with the scent of ash and freedom. The survivors did not turn back. The land that had once chained them now lay open behind them, unrecognizable. The legacy that had defined the Carters was gone, reduced to memory and dust. And in that silence, something new began to breathe, something unclaimed, uncertain, alive. Something darker had been lurking, something far more dangerous to reveal, or so it seemed. Smoke rose slowly from the ruins of Carter Hill, rising in thin gray ribbons that drifted upward until they disappeared into the pale morning light. The air carried the scent of ash and wet earth, the remnants of a night that had rewritten the order of generations. The grand house that once crowned the hill was gone, reduced to a shape barely recognizable, its columns cracked, its walls blackened. The wind moved through the ruins like memory itself. Restless, searching for meaning in what was left behind. Evelyn sat among the debris, her hands trembling as they turned the brittle pages of a scorched Bible. The ink had run, the words melted into one another until they were nothing more than shadows of faith. She stared at them, trying to recall the order of things, the verses she had spoken with conviction, the justifications that had once made sense. But all she could see was the reflection of flame against the torn paper. She whispered her children's names, one by one, as though repetition might return them to her. The silence that answered her was deeper than grief, it was the sound of consequence, the echo of a world finally confronting itself. Around her, the land that had once bent to her will now refuse to obey. The trees stood bare of leaves though it was not yet winter, their branches blackened and brittle. The ground, once plowed by the hands of the enslaved, was scarred and uneven, the crops gone to cinder. The wealth that had been counted in ledgers and measured in generations had vanished overnight. What remained was truth, stripped of its finery, raw and unrelenting. Evelyn lifted her face to the sky and for the first time in her life, she did not pray. She simply watched the smoke rise until it disappeared, as if she were watching her own story depart from her. Far from the ruins, Samuel and the others walked toward the horizon. They moved through the woods quietly, the path uncertain, the world ahead a question without answer. The nights were cold, the days long, yet none turned back. They carried what little they owned, cloth, tools, a few books, and memory heavier than any burden. Samuel walked at the edge of the group, listening to their low voices, their footsteps against the earth. He no longer spoke of redemption, the word felt too fragile for what was needed. Instead, he thought of responsibility, of how truth must live even when comfort dies. He had chosen to walk away from the inheritance of power and toward the inheritance of memory, and in that choice there was peace, however uncertain. Martha walked ahead of them, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had not spoken much since the fire, but her silence was not fear, it was preparation. Each step she took carried with it the weight of the past and the pulse of the future. When the group stopped to rest by the river, she began to speak, her voice low and steady. She told them that the land they left behind would someday be covered by grass and time, that new houses would rise and new names would be written, but that the soil would always remember. She said that history has a way of returning when it is forgotten, that silence is a seed that grows into chains. Her words became the fire that replaced the one they had left behind, this time not to destroy, but to illuminate. As the years passed, the story of Carter Hill traveled far beyond Georgia. It changed with each telling, carried by those who survived, reshaped by those who listened. Some called it legend, others called it warning. But beneath every version remained the same truth, that no empire built on silence can endure, and that the cost of denial is always greater than the cost of confession. The name Carter Hill faded from records, but the memory of what happened there lingered in songs, in whispers, in the quiet places where people gathered to remember what they had been told to forget. And now the story reaches you. You who listen across distance and time, you who watch from places the Carters could never imagine, from cities built on glass and light, from quiet rooms where history feels distant, from corners of the world where stories like this are still unfolding in different forms. You are part of this chain of remembrance. Every retelling, every word spoken aloud, every acknowledgement of what came before keeps the silence from returning. History does not end. It waits for those who stop paying attention. Wherever you are watching from, remember this: the world changes only when memory refuses to fade. Speak of what you've heard. Ask what else has been forgotten. Let these ashes remind you that silence protects no one, that truth, once uncovered, belongs to all. Share this story, not for spectacle, but for remembrance. Let others hear it. Let it reach farther than Carter Hill ever did. And if you are still here with this story, if it has reached you across the noise of time, then let your presence be known. Tell us where you are listening from. Be part of the memory that refuses to disappear. Please subscribe to this channel and share this video. This is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of understanding. Wherever you are, carry it forward.